Wendy's with us today. It's good to see you. Do you like shopping on Christmas, or is it kind of a drag?
You know, that's a really good question. I've started doing the online stuff a little bit more. It's
better.
so convenient, and you go to the department stores and they don't have what you want. So I think online's the way to go.
My wife is a catalog aficionado. I think the catalog companies would go out of business if she left the scene. She's their favorite. But anyhow, I was reading yesterday about China. They make a big deal about Christmas, China. Big deal about Christmas. And so this young couple goes out, and the girl really digs shopping. So she carried her fiancé along with her for 5 agonizing hours of shopping.
That's a nice
And he
fiancé.
says, I just can't do this anymore. And she said, well, I've got to look at another pair of shoes. She said, you've got a closet full of shoes now. You don't need any more shoes. And she said, you're just an old skinflint. You're going to ruin Christmas. And she stormed out. Honestly. So what does he do? He jumps off the ledge of this 3 or 4 story department store and kills himself. He committed suicide.
Oh my word, that is the worst Christmas story I've ever
You've heard "Shop Till I Drop"? Well, they did it. Okay. Well, those guys in Congress are at it again. I don't know if we're going to jump off of buildings when we hear about this budget deal, but is it good for taxpayers and the economy, or will it just mean more government spending?
The people who put the plan together say it does cut the deficit and avoids another government shutdown. But as David Brody reports, not everyone thinks it's a good plan.
In Washington nowadays, it seems success on budget talks is defined by Democrats and Republicans just agreeing to something, anything for that matter. And so it was a rare sight to see a top Republican and a top Democrat standing side by side announcing a budget deal.
We are showing that this divided government can work at its basic functioning levels, which is paying the bills.
Here's the framework of that common ground. $63 billion in increased domestic spending. That's because Democrats were able to eliminate half of those sharp sequester cuts that Republicans fought hard for last year. So that's a victory for Democrats. But GOP leaders say it's also good news for Republicans because those sequester cuts were going to hurt military spending. Well, what else do Republicans get? $85 billion in budget cuts, but they're going to happen over time. So, doing the math, that's $85 billion in reduced spending minus $63 billion in increased spending, and it comes to roughly $22 billion in deficit reduction. But the spending increases will start right away. The spending cuts don't. In an interview with CBN News, Senator John Thune says he's taking a wait-and-see approach.
It looks like it would increase spending for a couple of years in exchange for some savings that would be achieved in future years. And I think what's going to be really important for a lot of Republicans is what are those savings and are they meaningful? And is this something that's a good trade-off?
President Obama is praising the deal, and so are House and Senate leaders. All of them say this agreement gives Americans the confidence that there will not be any talk of a government shutdown for 2 years. However, the deal does not address future debates over raising the debt ceiling. But for now, the focus for many conservatives is that they believe Republicans are getting taken to the cleaners yet again. Influential conservative blogger Eric Erickson writes how the deal, quote, does not impact the national debt. It does not reform entitlements. Senator Marco Rubio blasted it too, saying, quote, this budget continues Washington's irresponsible budgeting decisions. And the Tea Party Express called this deal, quote, a baby step backward. Now, conservative budget chairman Paul Ryan is feeling all of this heat, but defending the deal.
This says let's cut spending in a smarter way, some permanent spending cuts to pay for some temporary sequester relief, resulting in net deficit reduction without raising taxes. That's fiscal responsibility. That's fiscal conservatism.
Ryan believes the House will pass this deal, and Patty Murray is confident Democrats will do the same in the Senate. But whatever happens, Republicans like Thune believe under the Obama administration, true, meaningful reform will be hard to come by.
Most of what happens in Washington, it seems like to me at least, is, okay, how can we spend more at the federal level? How can we regulate more? How can we tax more? And that to me is the opposite prescription for what we need to get the economy growing again.
David Brody, CBN News, Washington.
Isn't it a shame that the Republicans sell out, the Democrats sell out? All they want to do is keep the interest groups off their back and spend and spend and spend and spend. We've got a potentially $1 trillion a year deficit, and you're going to take off $20 billion. That's going to be what you're going to offer to the American people, and that it may be illusory. It's crazy. And all the waste and all the pork and all the things that are there, everybody with the special interest, they're lining up at the trough to get their piece of the pork. Well, what about you and me? Sooner or later, our children and grandchildren are going to have to pay for this thing, or this great country we love so much is going to be in the ash heap of history. Well, the budget won't be the big issue in next year's elections, but the president's health care law will. And new polls show it's causing enormous political problems for the president and the Democrats. John Jessup has that story from Washington. Here's John.
Pat, that's right. People who don't have health insurance don't like Obamacare, according to a new poll from the Wall Street Journal and NBC News. Only 24% of uninsured Americans think Obamacare is a good idea, while half think it's a bad one. And a new Quinnipiac poll finds only 34% of voters approve of how the president has handled health care, while 62% disapprove. For the first time this year, more voters say they'd pick a Republican over a Democrat in a generic race for Congress. Turning overseas, is the United States losing influence in the Middle East? That's the question many of America's traditional allies are asking after the signing of the recent heavily criticized nuclear deal with Iran. And as Chris Mitchell reports from Jerusalem, the consequences are already ripping through the region.
After Geneva, many Middle East experts see a stronger Iran, a weaker America, and a region teetering on the brink.
So we in the Middle East, we in Israel, and as I see in the Arab press, because this is my business, to follow Arab press, they are confused and they don't believe anymore in American influence in the region.
For decades, American influence acted like a rudder steering events in the Middle East. Now, many Mideast experts, like former Israeli ambassador to Egypt, Zvi Mazel, believe the region is losing its way.
The Middle East lost its compass, you see? In the old times, there used to be the Soviet Union and the United States, but now everyone goes his own direction.
The perception is that America will not be here around for long, and Iran is the coming superpower.
A major change in U.S. Mideast policy is the attempt to turn Iran from an adversary to a friend.
It's not completely friend yet, but I'm saying it's on the way too. I believe this is what President Obama sees, that there will be a dialogue with Iran and there will be relations with America, and Iran will become a good boy, a good student. We don't believe it.
The diplomatic courtship with Iran and the perception of waning U.S. influence have led to shifting and unprecedented alliances in the region. Since many Mideast nations see Iran as an existential threat, the Gulf states are considering uniting for their own self-defense. And both Egypt and Saudi Arabia have reached out to find another ally besides the United States.
There is now a dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Russia. It doesn't happen every day.
Can you believe it? Saudi Arabia. Prince Bandar went twice to Moscow lately.
Pincus, Mazel, and others now see the Middle East with America retreating and Russia advancing.
Putin is really a very happy man. Everywhere where America is going away, he's coming in immediately.
Mazel warns Russia's comeback in the Middle East is just one consequence of U.S. Mideast policy. He also warns if Iran does get a nuclear bomb, it would be the beginning of a Mideast nuclear arms race. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Pat, Chris's story paints a sobering and dire picture.
The former Secretary of the Navy had a piece, I think the day before yesterday, in the Wall Street Journal, very telling about the retreat that the United States has made in its military forces. We've got half as many divisions as we used to have. We've got less than half, maybe a third of as many ships as we used to have. We have, in terms of airplanes ready to fly, about half or more. In other words, our forces have diminished dramatically. And yet, according to this former Secretary of the Navy, very perceptive, the amount of overhead in the Defense Department has risen exponentially. A huge number of people not doing anything but pushing paper. And in terms of the tip of the spear, the people who are on the front lines, their influence has waned and diminished. But in terms of the paper pushers, grown enormously, which is a definition of bureaucratic waste and mismanagement and fatness. That way all throughout the federal government. We are fat, and we are lazy, and we are mismanaged, and it's just right across the board, because we have at the head of our government somebody who never ran anything, never been in charge of anything, never met a payroll. All those things are there. Never, never, never. And he doesn't understand what these things are. He's never been in the military. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand geopolitics. But he has a prism on the world that was shaped by his radical father. And he has a prism that was shaped by some of his friends who were radical leftists. And his spiritual mentor, who at one time hated America, that's who is running our country. We're kind of waiting like, are we ever going to get delivered from this thing? This is a great nation. It's like, you know, the Gulliver and the Lilliputians. I mean, here's this giant who was being held down by all these pygmies, and we're a giant. America is a giant being held down by these pygmies. Time to pray. Lots of prayer and some action maybe in these next elections. Well, there's something bad going on to our neighbor to the south. We have a huge audience in Brazil, as we did, and now we've got some bad news coming out of Brazil. John?
Pat, that's right. Child sex prostitution in Brazil has been on the rise for years, and the London Guardian newspaper reports that officials fear an explosion of child sex workers before the World Cup soccer match next year. The number of child sex workers in Brazil reached about 500,000 in 2012, up from 100,000 in 2001. Major sporting events often attract an increase in sex for sale. Officials say they'll try to fight it in Brazil, but they admit they'll have their work cut out for them. Here at home, almost 70% of the country is covered in snow today. That's the most this early in the season in more than a decade. And while the snowstorm that's hammered much of the Northeast is finally letting up, forecasters warn don't expect the freezing temperatures to disappear anytime soon. Caitlin Burke has the story.
Most of the Northeast is waking up to a slushy mess today. Tuesday's storm dumped as much as 7 inches of snow in areas from Virginia to New England.
I worked in it for 35 years in the snow, in the airport, so it was horrible.
In Washington, D.C., schools, government offices, and many businesses shut down for the day. While they're back up and running today, many travelers are still trying to get home after flight delays in several major airports on the East Coast.
I'm really upset because really I don't know when I'm going to leave here.
People generally angry also, a little frustrated, not knowing what was going to happen.
And the roads aren't much better. Overnight cold temperatures cause many to freeze over again, making for dangerous commutes.
It's very hard to stop even with anti-lock brakes.
And dangerous winter conditions out west led to a search and rescue mission in Nevada. A family was stranded in sub-zero temperatures for 48 hours after their car flipped in the snow. Rescue teams say they built a fire to stay warm until help arrived.
We were all great, warm. All the kids were in good spirits. Mom and Dad were happy to see us.
Forecasters across the country warn drivers to be careful on the roads and, if possible, to stay home until they're cleared. Now that storm system's moving out, the focus shifts to the extreme cold it's leaving behind. Forecasters warn that in some areas over the next few days, temperatures will drop into the single digits. Caitlin Burke, CBN News.
Pat, are you still campaigning for people to move to Virginia Beach to escape this winter mess?
Absolutely. We're in a pocket of warmth and joy and delight down here. We don't have all those problems.
Excuse me, I had ice covering my car this morning.
Oh, the Chamber of Commerce didn't authorize that statement.
Right. It took me like 10 minutes just to get the ice off my windshield. Now, the snow, I know it causes a lot of problems for travelers, but it's so beautiful. And we are, because we're just a few hours south, we don't get it.
Well, the Gulf Stream swings in here. The Virginia sticks out a little bit into the ocean, and the Gulf Stream comes up, and it's a warming trend. So right where we are, it's warmer than usual, but it can also be miserably cold when it gets cold. And the people here really don't know how to drive in the snow, so it's dangerous. An inch of snow gets to be a catastrophe. Where I grew up, I mean, you took it for granted. You just drove in snow all year round. I mean, all winter long, yeah. Okay.
I'm a little jealous. I love snow.
Okay.
A nativity display at South Carolina's Shaw Air Force Base was quickly removed after complaints from an atheist organization. Volunteers from the base chapel set up the display near where an annual tree lighting ceremony takes place. But less than 3 hours after the Military Religious Freedom Foundation lodged a complaint, the display was removed. An Air Force spokeswoman says officials are trying to determine the proper placement and arrangement of a new display that reflects more than a single group. Gay sex is illegal in India. The Supreme Court in that country struck down a law that would decriminalize homosexuality. The judges say only lawmakers could change the law that makes homosexuality illegal, not the courts. The law against homosexuality dates back to the 1860s. In 2009, the New Delhi High Court said the law violated fundamental human rights. Conservatives and religious groups argued against the court's ruling with an alliance that included the All India Muslim Law Board, Christian groups, and Hindu spiritual leaders. Well, you can always get the latest from CBN News by going to our website at cbnnews.com.